We'd like to welcome you to our second class of the day, presented by Elder Tanner. We'd like to thank him for all of the time he spends to prepare for these classes and to share his knowledge with us.
Okay, here we go. Well, one of the basic questions that comes up almost always starts out something like this. I have an ancestor, usually a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, who I can't find. And basically what I would do is ask, well, where and when are we talking about this? And they say, well, he was in England and he was born about 1680 or 1650. We don't know. And I said, where in English? Well, we're not real sure. Well, with that point, we've sort of launched out into Never Never Land, because there's no way in the world we can begin to answer the question. But one of the things that always comes up, even if they do know the place and the name and some of the details about the person, is that each time you go back one more generation, you're going further and further into situations where the records begin to disappear. So this particular presentation is aimed at giving you some perspective, depending on the geographic area, about how far back would be reasonable to assume that there would be records. And once you get to a certain point where those records are no longer available, it would be unreasonable to assume that you would want to spend a great deal of time looking for further records, unless you want to go through a certain process of education. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So let's get going here. There are two key words here. One of those are reliable, and when the other one is available. So when we're talking about records, we need to know that the records are reliable. And that means that they are, in a sense, records which were made at or time of the event by someone who witnessed the event or had the duty to report the event. And that takes out everything from well, it doesn't clear out census records, because they had a duty to report the event, but they didn't have a duty to report the event of the birth of a person listed in a census event. So even though you may have a date, an approximate date, or by an age of a person in a census record, does not mean that that particular record has as great an accuracy as an actual birth record that was made at the time. So this is kind of the thing. That's the reliability factor. The reliability factor is determined by looking at who created the record, when was the record created, and where was the record created. And if you can't determine that from the record, then there's always a significant amount of doubt as to the accuracy of the record. Okay, so then the other question, of course, is availability. And what we mean by availability is a little bit more complicated, because availability applies to the documents that identify individuals and families. Just because an old record is available doesn't mean it says anything at all about information that is genealogically significant. So we need to know that the records actually identify people. And that is, there are cutoff dates in every culture or every country around the world when the records that going back no longer are reliable about identifying individuals and no longer are accurate with regards to showing parentage, showing relationships between a parent and a child. So what we're looking for, and I will repeat this a number of times, is in order to move back one generation in a genealogical research, you need to have a valid, supportable, historic record that conforms to the concepts that I just said, and also shows a definite parent-child relationship. So a census record, for example, listing the people in the family, and they're listed as, by implication or otherwise, that they are listed as children, is one type of record that would work. A birth record that noted the parents would be another. And it goes on and on. There's church records. There's lots of different records. Even deeds sometimes have parent-child relationships. So that's part of the process of doing genealogical research, is that you're looking for these parent-child relationship records. Now, once you have that relationship, then there's a whole bunch of other things that you want to get. Like you want to know a lot about the families. So there's sort of an endless number of records. Like the rule says, there are always more records. And that rule is true to the extent that you're willing to put forth the effort and the time involved in finding all those records and trying to decipher them in some cases. So what we're looking at is some time periods here. So these are kind of, they're not cut and dried time periods. So when I say 1500, that, you could say, well, what about 1499? I mean, you can always go and say you're going a little bit back and forth with these kinds of figures, but these are kind of what you call rules of thumb. That means that generally speaking, when you're doing record searches, these rules are going to give you guidance as to how much effort you want to spend on searching for an additional generation in your family tree. And this statement here is my general rule of thumb and very commonly accepted among genealogists who have spent a considerable amount of time looking for records. This does not say that there are not records before 1500. It just says that a few records exist about individuals and families, but they're scarce, hard to find, and they're hard to translate, and they're hard to read. So basically, if we were looking at a kind of a curve on a graph of how difficult something was, at 1500, it goes almost straight up. In other words, you're just going to have more and more difficulty every year that you go back before 1500. So that's kind of the first rule. And this is kind of important because very few of the people who have pedigrees online that go back to before 1500 have ever looked at an original record. At this point, when you get back that far, you're almost always relying on compiled books written by somebody who went out and copied somebody else's book. And so one of the processes that you have to go through when you start researching back before 1500, or try to, is trying to find someone who actually did some original work and didn't just copy someone else out of another book. And so the accuracy of this stuff is highly questionable. And the rule here is very simple. When you start copying material out of a book that you haven't personally seen an original record for or had a reference to, then you are basically not doing any more genealogy. You're basically copying stuff. That's not genealogy. So if you have an incorporate record, if you find the original record, and I'm showing you a record from about 1500. So you're probably getting back into stuff like this. And my question is, do you read Latin, which was the most common language in Europe, for example, or whatever other language the country that they were speaking back in that time period? There is enough time that has passed since 1500 that languages that were spoken in the 1500s are no longer recognizable out of the language that are spoken today. And that's called linguistic drift. And what that means is that the languages change over time. And if they go change enough, then what people spoke at that time period is not related to this time period. So 1500 gets back into what's called Middle English, if you're speaking English, for example. And if you go back a couple of hundred more years, you're into Old English, which is like learning a foreign language. So these are some of the restrictions and limitations that happen. Now, whenever I say this, somebody comes up and says, oh yeah, but Chinese records go back to 300 BC or 600 BC or whatever they say, whichever line they're thinking about. That's true, they do, and they're simply a father son, primarily. Sometimes have the women in them. Record that was kept by the families, and they're valid, and they go back generation after generation after generation. If you're Chinese, then your biggest challenge is finding your family book. It's called a family book, generally a kind of generic name for these things. And that's the big problem, because sometimes the family book has not been digitized and is in the possession of someone who still lives in China. So if you're not living in China and you're not doing your genealogy in China, you may have some difficulties. There are things that change, as I mentioned at first, from culture to culture. You relying on living in a country that is a modern country, then all of these rules will change no matter, depending on where you go. And oral histories, for example, in Africa can go back generations upon generation because they're memorized recitals of the ancestry. But what you're missing in these kinds of records, when I mean this by this Chinese and some of the other traditional and oral histories, is anybody but the direct line ancestors back and back and back and back. In some cases, other kind of interesting people have been added in for reasons, but there's nothing like full family group records with everybody's name of all the children and everything, except in rare occasions. Sometimes everybody in the family is listed. But these are whole different worlds. This isn't what, if you're working with Chinese, then that's your world, and you work by your rules and your time limits and your the points when your records are no longer available. If you're working in Western European derived records, then you're subject to the Western European limits. And all I can say is there are different limits for all the different places and all the different countries. And what I'm doing today is simply explaining that point and showing examples. So we'll just look ahead here. Here's another very, very important thing. Last week, I sat down with somebody who wanted to get a record back in the 1800s. Now, that's not pushing any kind of time limit. Records are generally available in the 1800s. Basically, though, we went through all the records that we had available, and this was online and on Family Search. And there weren't any other sets of records outside of the countries we were involved in looking at. And the problem is that there were records missing. So we had traced it all through all the things, sitting there clicking for an hour or so, and basically found out that the records that were covering the time period that this particular patron was interested in were not there. And so these are very common. It's very common to have a gap. The most famous gap in the United States is the gap for the U.S. Census in 1890, which was traditionally thought to be burned because that's the story that was passed down, but only a part of it was burned and the rest was thrown away because they never appropriated the funds to take care of it. So there's a lot of things that are said and known about records that are only partially correct. So when we go into the records, basically, some of the records go further back than others. I mean, it's just logical that there are some places that go back. So when you look at the United States, the oldest records that go back that would have parent-child relationships in this country, in the United States, where I am today, are the early records that came from the first settlers. And the earliest English settlement is at Plymouth Colony. And those records go back to 1620. And that's the date that they are basically start. And when you go back into England, then you get a different, and in Europe, you get a different back line. That is, you get into other types of records, land and property transactions, probate, religious figures, royalty, all of those things. But the people who are included in those records include landowners and people who were basically, when the religions began keeping records, and if they're important figures or royalty figures, then you have to end up being related to those people. Now, it's logical to think that, you know, you would be related to somebody back there, but that's possible. My rule here was that, you know, people, kings and queens, also had children. So we know that there are people related to those people. But this is when you start getting into that kind of rule of thumb on 1500, because unless you're well into the royalty of being related to somebody and be long before 1500, then you are probably going to be launching off into the books that I referred to, which have been copied from copies. So if we look, we need to look at the history of the area you're researching to see when the first usable records could have been made. I mean, it just seems like a simple rule, but it's really not simple. And I will give you some good examples of what I mean by that. So when we move on, what we don't avoid in family history research and what we call genealogy is going through this door to fantasy land. In other words, we've left all these records behind and we're wandering off into sort of a forest here that represents the area that we're no longer able to have concrete records that illustrate or that can document the people that we're researching. And when we do that, we're basically doing what I said earlier, and that is copying records off of somebody's book that they wrote, and they did the compiling, or they copied someone who did the compiling, which is the more common thing. Okay, so we're not going to go, but when you're going back past the point where there are valid records that show parent-child relationships, then you've left it. You're out into fantasy land there. And in this case, here's the example. Okay, so we need to look at the history of the area you're researching to see when the first usable records could have been made. There's a time limit on every one of the places. Every time there's a record, a set of records, usually called collections, is that there's a beginning point. There's some point at which that particular type of record was created for the first time. It may be in prehistory. In other words, it could go clear back to, you know, couple of thousand years. But in most cases, it's not. Most cases, and that was why when I referred back to the rule that said 1500, that was the reasonable date when many or most of all of the records that pertain to individual people no longer are readily available or even accurate in most cases. So what we do we need to avoid going through that date of reasonableness. And then once they're out there, you're into a fantasy land. What you're into is you've started copying from books or other records that are copies of other records or copies of copies of copies. And the accuracy goes way down. And there's just really no reliable thing. Now, when people always say, well, the kings and queens, well, you know, the reality of it is the kings and queens didn't keep any better records than anybody else. And most of the time, and this is the case with a lot of the records that I deal with and a lot of the questions that I deal with when they're back trying to work their way through some royal line, they're always saying, oh, well, this person that I go to was the illegitimate son of such and such king. Well, yeah. And so the problem is, we don't really begin establishing any reliable measure of paternity until they started doing paternity tests with DNA. So I really not persuaded a lot of times that these old royal lines are very accurate, because it was easy to say somebody was an illegitimate son if you couldn't figure out who their parents were, and it was often easier to say it was the illegitimate son of the king if the king was not a very well-liked king. So that was kind of the things that could happen. So we need to always check the date of the first settlement, or when a town or country was established. Okay, so here's a record right off of Family Search. Now, of course, and this is my line, and the question that everybody asks is, well, if it's wrong, why don't you change it? Because you can change it, on Family Search. And I say, I've got to keep some of these because they're priceless examples of how things go wrong. And so they're just my examples out there. Now, if you find them and you decide you want to change it, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. I'll just find another one there. There are plenty of examples out there. So this one, for example, this line, which is a line from Wales, the surname is Morgan, which is one of the most common names in Wales. And here it's showing Shepherdstown, Berkeley, Virginia, as the place where this person was born in 1734. This sounds perfectly reasonable. There are 3 sources. Everybody can rely on those 3 sources. But Shepherdstown wasn't established until 1762, and Berkeley County wasn't established until 1772. So neither of these places existed in 1734. And to kind of add insult to injury, here's the next person. This is the father, and this is Jacob Morgan, and he's born in Shepherdstown and died in Berkeley. Now, he was, if we go back and see, Berkeley actually was in existence, but Shepherdstown was not in existence in 1700. And then we go back another generation, and here's another person born in 1655 in West Virginia. And not only now we have Shepherdstown not in Berkeley County, Virginia, but 50 years earlier than the last one, we have them in West Virginia. Now, I don't expect you to think of when was West Virginia formed, or when did when was it created? But it's simple. It was created in 1862. It was during the Civil War. So anything you want to know about West Virginia is post-Civil War. And Shepherdstown, which didn't exist, and the state didn't exist, and the county didn't exist. Anyway, all of that. So this is where you can get caught up in copying and thinking that you're going back in time. But you can see at this point, we'd have 0 sources and 0 memories. The 4 sources here do not substantiate any of this information in the other record. Okay, so that's kind of the thing. Now, we're back to the Chinese. We're back to people who say, well, what about Chinese, and are they accurate? Yes, they are fairly accurate. Most people rely on them. And there are 86 recorded generations for over 2,500 years. And the Chinese philosophers Confucius is thought to have 3 million descendants, probably more than that. I think this statement probably was probably made a few generations back, and there's probably 2 or 3 times that many, or maybe much more descendants of this one person. And that's the other issue, because back when you get betting back into these people, if they did in fact have descendants, then they have millions of them, and you have millions of cousins. So which one of you on all the lines that you're following are correct? So I'm not discouraging anyone from doing research. I'm simply saying that when you go back and back and back and back, you are going to reach a point at which it is unreasonable to continue any further back. And the reason I mentioned this, and I wasn't going to mention the magic words, but I say that when you start to get past into the 1500s, you have launched yourself out into a different area of actually finding original records and examining them yourself to see that the information is correct. Now, if it's well substantiated and you have a line that goes back to whenever, then that's perfectly fine. But I'm trying to keep people from spending more of their genealogical energies on these older records that are harder and harder and harder to get. If you like that, that's fine. I'm not just trying to say don't do it. I'm just saying you've got to understand what you're getting yourself into. So in both North and South America, and these are going to be kind of absolute figures. I mean, there are absolute figures here, and that is usable records begin with the arrival of the Europeans in about 1500. 1492, when Columbus did his first voyage. Yeah, argue that there were Vikings here. They didn't leave any records, but there are some traditional stories that talk about the settlement of, or at least the Viking settlements in Canada. And yes, if you happen to be related to those people, you do have a traditional line that goes back to before 1500. But that isn't, but for all the rest of us, except those who have descendants of the first group of people to go to the North American shore and Canada and get back to Greenland and Iceland, these records start about 1500. So in 1539, and I'm going to focus now on Arizona because obviously I have my background in Arizona, but 1539, Marcos de Niza explored what is now Arizona, and he was followed by Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, usually known as Coronado, and if you come from Arizona, it's Coronado. And basically, it's more or less near where Tucson is located, and that's around 1700. And this is a rock that's in South Mountain in south of Phoenix, Arizona, and South Mountain. It's a city park, and it was reportedly scratched there by Marcos de Niza, the original scratch on kind of a petroglyph for Marcos de Niza. So if you're looking for Arizona, the cutoff's around 1700 if your ancestors spoke Spanish, and if they spoke English, that's a lot later, because the first permanent English settlements weren't made until in the 1800s. So here's you go. There's no European records in the United States, southwestern United States, before about 1700, and few until more than 100 years later. Now, what if you lived in Massachusetts, East Coast? Well, we do have it. We know when the Pilgrims landed, when they arrived in Massachusetts, or what's now Massachusetts, and came on land, and that's on the 11th of November of 1620. They didn't stay on land. They lived there in the winter. They spent their lives mostly in the boats. They just stayed there on the boats, which is one reason why they had such a tremendous mortality rate, and that only a very few of the original ones survived that first winter. So here's where you go back to with your ancestry. There's a few people that date back earlier, because Jamestown was founded earlier than that, about 1605 in that range. And so there are a few people, and they have descendants that go back, or claims of descendancy from people that go back that far. But you're just not going to find any records, any written records in the United States, area of what is now the United States or Canada, before 1600. It's just not going to happen, because there's just anybody here on the East Coast. Now, in the West Coast, it's even a little, I mean, in Southwest, you remember it said 1700. So there's really not anything much after those initial encroachments. And in this part of the world, there's Florida, with the landings in Florida and the settlements in Florida, and those in St. Augustine, and those settlements also date back very early into the 1600s. But those are the cutoff dates. And as what I'm saying here is not to give a date for every single place, but to alert you that there are those dates and that you need to do a little bit of research to determine. I usually look at earliest, just do a Google search that says earliest records for, and then that gives me an idea. And then I see if that actually is correct by looking online and seeing what record sets may be available that predate that. And so, but when you reach these absolute lines, then you're really at the end of what you can find. So this is a Massachusetts, it's an indenture, it's called an indenture. It's a sale of a piece of property. And this are Massachusetts town records. This is a vital records project for Massachusetts. And the whole idea here is to collect and list all the people who were in the records of Massachusetts up to the time. In other words, they're trying to do everything from the 19th to the 20th century and all the compilations since and going back to 1600. So this is one project. There's also what's called the Great Migration Project that is housed on the New England Historic Genealogical Society website, American Ancestors, that also lists all the people who came to America from England, from the British Isles. So basically, these are there are documented records that are accepted records that show these people. Now, if you go back and your people don't happen to be in these records, then you basically have to do a lot of original research that all these people have already done and made it. Now, in going back on these records, for example, they actually provide the record. So they're giving you the actual citation to the record where it's located. So it's not like they're just listing all this stuff. And therefore, this is a valid kind of information. And then it's up to you to go look at, from their references, their citations, to go out and look at the original records. Now, the U.S. Census records begin in 1790. So we do 10 years. This is when the United States came into existence, and they began doing censuses in 1790 as provided for in the U.S. Constitution. But they did not begin naming all the people in the family until the 1850 census. So this is one of the first limitations that you run into when you're working on individual situations. Now, I know there's a question about records held by individual families and et cetera, Bible records and things like that. It's entirely possible that some individual family had records that predated some of the general rule situations. But the problem of that is usually the very simple explanation that there are, even if you have just one couple going back in the 1700s, by the time you could bring that to the present, you'd have it would be remarkable. It would be a good find. It would be kind of an extraordinary event if you were able to find out which of all those thousands and thousands of descendants still had the record, or if you were fortuitous enough to have it listed in a Bible record. So there's record sets, but each record set still has a limitation, because Bible records only existed when individuals in Europe were able to own a Bible. And if you can go back there and find those record names, those time periods. Okay, so many times people come to me and say they're looking for a birth certificate or a death certificate. And when I ask what time period are you speaking about, they give me a time period in the middle 1800s. So part of the process of learning about genealogy is learning sort of generally speaking, these things that I've been discussing about when these records may have been available. This particular quote is taken from the FamilySearch.org Research Wiki, which has this information for the United States and every state and territory, and every county. And so you go into any county, and you'll get a click that gives you this kind of information. These are the beginning dates. This means the earliest records we are aware of, and that doesn't mean that there aren't others. It just means that they're become extraordinarily rare at about the time of this that are listed here. So you can see all the different standard records that we would look at: birth, marriage, death, court, land, probate, and census records, all come into being sometime in the mid to late 1800s. And then there's a statement down here, the qualifying statement, that says that births and deaths were only required by the state in July of 1909. And what does this mean, general compliance? That meant that generally speaking, all of the counties were actually keeping those records, was only accomplished until 1926. And if you keep doing this in the United States, you're going to find counties and states where there's still no general compliance. In other words, you still are kind of lucky if you find a birth or marriage record, because they just simply did not require them. Just for a rule, parish records in England began in about 1538. There are some very rare parish records that go back before 1538, but this was the year that King Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church and ordered the now Church of England people, the parish priests, to actually keep making records. Not all of the parishes complied with the order. It's not unusual, and it wasn't cleaned up until Queen Victoria. So these are the people, these records are, you'll be very hard-pressed to find an English parish register before 1538, and many do not start until much later. And if you get past 1538 and there happen to be some parish registered records, that's great. But what happens is we switch over and start looking at probate records, which I mentioned early on, go way back and go continue for quite a considerable period of time. Okay, so let's look at this. This is a question of probate records. Now, whenever I mention a cutoff record for parish registers, then those people who know that they can go back a few years further always say, oh, of course we could go back further with probate records. Yes. Well, that's true. You can go back, and this is the earliest probate record, UK extracted probate record, that is in existence online and Family Search. Now, I don't know if it's in other places. There may be some that go back a little bit further than that, but this is pretty old. And the question is, who had a will, who owned property, and who would have had their property probated? And because this gets back into the nobility and the manorial landholdings of Europe and England, that this is sort of the rule of when you're going to keep finding those records. You may push it back from 1538 to 1269, and that's entirely possible. But at this point, you start running out of probate records. So if we go all over Europe to look for parish registers, that means any place where people may have started keeping records in Europe, the earliest parish registers that I'm able to locate online with any kind of a search is Givry in 1303. So this is the oldest parishes. They're French. But they didn't begin officially keeping records until the 1500s. So you may or may not find any reference to your French ancestors. So I've talked and mentioned about royal lines. So what about royal lines? What are the dates of the earliest reliable records? So Gorm, the first official monarch of Denmark, died in 958 AD, and he's one of the oldest. So he is the oldest royal bloodline in Europe. So if you're descendant from Gorm, you can go back and copy some records that'll let your pedigree look like it goes back to 958 AD. And that's, that would not be impossible, since he probably is related to a considerable portion of the entire country, all the countries in Europe, because they had battles and wars and boundary changes many times since 958 AD. In England, the first king that has records is from 839. It's about 839 to lived from 839 to 855. King Athelworth Wolf, and he's the oldest British king. So there's your other cutoff dates. As I mentioned just a while back, your genealogical research ends when you begin copying names out of a book without verifying your relationship. So unless the book has extensive and exhaustive record keeping and gives you citations to all the records. And what I would always do if I had that situation, if I had a book that I was going to be relying on for going back, and that's what I did with all of my what are called surname books, meaning the descendancy books that show my ancestor and all their descendants. So I have a whole series of those from different ancestors that bring forward all the information, and I show up in all these books, or most of them, and my rest of my family does, and depending on the time periods. So those have in the past, at least for me, been a good starting point, because the records there seem to be correct. But as you go back in those books, and as you work your way back out of copying the books, as I said earlier, you're basically stepping off the known world into the fantasy world, because there are no ways for you to personally review and verify the books that are put down as the sources for all these early people. So that's kind of the summary of what we're doing here. Let's think about some of the challenges you might have of trying to document your genealogy before 1300. What are the things you're going to face that are going to make your life difficult? Okay, so the first of these in the list is the language, and I mentioned that briefly. Linguistic drift, or whatever, phonology and phonetical drift, and all of the other things are realities. The people that established that as a principle were the Grimm brothers Grimm, the ones who wrote the fairy tales. And they were the linguists who first in Europe documented the language and mapped out the sound changes of the language over time, and that the sound evolved of the languages. So if you were to listen to a recording of your family members made 100 years ago, you probably wouldn't have, well, in 1923 you would. So you may find that they speak differently than you do. And the answer to that is there's always been, and always will be, a drift in the language, which allows the way the sounds of the words sound. So that's really the first one. And at the same time the language changes, then the words change, and if you want to call it spelling of the words or representation of the words, the way the words are represented on the page changes. and everything becomes, and it gives you another step of things that are organized things that you would have to do in order to begin to translate and to begin to understand what these records said. And of course, there's the handwriting issue. Now, today, unfortunately, even some of my own grandchildren who are now out of high school still can't read cursive handwriting. And that's like they are disabled, but they're not, is because nobody's teaching them cursive handwriting anymore. So they're not getting used to reading different cursive handwritings. But even if you're still a very persistent penman and can write, then you still have a limitation because the text and the old fonts or different typefaces are some of them are extremely difficult to read. And also, there's always a flag that goes up that says, how do we know these records are accurate? The old ones, particularly if they don't name any substantiable that would sustain the validity or the value of the records from some kind of contemporary document that you could actually read and verify. So there's a whole bunch of different things here. And right down to it, it's the availability of the manuscript. Now, in our day and age, many of those documents have been digitized, but they may all still be under an embargo with an agreement with the publisher that they get their copy of the book back at the end of the period. And so that's really what's happening here is you have to know if this really is available. Now, it doesn't do you any good to say that this person probably appeared in the manuscript sometime earlier if you can't find the manuscript. So when you're getting back in those royal lines, it's wonderful to say that you're a direct line back to Athelwulf or someone like that. But have you actually seen the documents? In other words, you maybe read about it in a book and it says that he had a son named and he had a son named and he had a son named, and all of a sudden it ends up being somebody you have in your line, and so you copy all that and you've got your line back. Well, that's what I was talking about earlier, about leaving the realm of genealogy and going into just copying records, which without looking at the originals. So, suggestion: is little new work to be done in searching back before the 1500s. These records have been researched. That's why there's books. That's why there's all these manuscript collections. That's why there's a set of records. So, for example, on Family Search, if you go to the search tab under genealogies, there's a set of records in the community trees it contains all of the known families of Europe, royal families of Europe. And so there's the whole thing. You can do a search for your people, and there's the record. There's the explanation of what they have and where they got it. So all that's there. And my question is, if you enjoy copying all that into your family tree, go after it. But I would rather spend my time doing research for the rest of my family that is not documented yet. So this is, people just disagree, and you're perfectly fine to add that to the tree. I just wouldn't fight over any of the entries that you make in the Family Search family tree, because there's going to be a bunch of books that will disagree about either the number of the children, the names of the children, or the dates that associated with anything having to do with the family or the remote royal ancestor. Okay, any questions?
Somebody asked about a handout.
I'll just get a PDF of the slide deck here.
And the last, Jarly asked, so what's your opinions on lines that go back to Adam?
I have 2 videos that I've given on that, and they have very, very high numbers of viewing. There are no substantiated records lineal records anywhere in Europe from any descendants of anybody in Europe that go back before about 600 AD, and they're all up in Scandinavia someplace. And there's articles that have been written and studies that have been written, and so far nobody has ever contradicted those statements made back maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So no, there isn't anything, and it's pure speculation. Now, there is people today. Now, there was a hedge on that because a lot of people would do that by claiming that they had a line back to Charlemagne. Well, DNA studies have shown lately that everyone in Europe is probably, everyone who has European descendancy is probably descendant from Charlemagne. So you've got a lot of people that are related to you if you go back that far, like like a few 100 million. So that's, I mean, I don't know what the prestige is of having your line back to Charlemagne when every person in Europe is reportedly now a descendant from him. Anyway, those are the things, those are the real limits, and even with the kings. So I would, all of those are very questionable, even though they were sold as verified records over the, for a long period of time. Somebody made a lot of money off of selling pedigrees back to Adam, back in the early 20s, 30s, in that part, even into the 40s. Someone made a point about the China government recently destroyed all of the genealogical records. Well, recently is the wrong word. They did not do that recently. That was during the Cultural Revolution during Mao's period of time in Russia, in China, and that was quite a while ago. But it's not. They did not destroy all the family records. What happened when Mao did that, made that edict, is the people simply hid the records. They walled them up in the walls. They dug into pits and put them in boxes. They put them all around. And now the government has been reaffirming our royal and great heritage, and basically wanting to get all those books brought out to life so they can be documented and remembered. So the whole system in China has changed about that since there was that attempt to destroy. But some records did get destroyed, and some families of records are gone.
James, Diane wants, and I think this would be useful for everyone, regarding if you do sense that the place name in a record on Family Search doesn't reflect the standardized, what it should have been at that point in time, should you put in the correct place name for the time of the record? Or, I mean, that's
Yes.
what you should tie it to, right? If the birth record is 1820, this place should be standardized 1820.
Yeah. Okay. Now, when we started the family tree years ago, we didn't have standardized, and we didn't have all this stuff. And there were two different views in genealogy. One genealogy view was to record it as to the place where the record might be found today, but that's on the record. I mean, that's your citation. That tells you where you go to get the record. And so the rule that has become the most ascendant and most observed is to record any document in the place where the event occurred as it was known at the time. And the reason for that is that in doing any research, you're more likely to find the records if you look in the right county than you are if you're working in the new county that may not have any of the records at all.
And Family Search will generally give you the time period and tell you what the place was at that point in time. So it's not like you always have to do all the research to look it up.
Well, the research is very simple in the United States because we have, for instance, the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries published by the Newberry Library in Chicago. And the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries tells you the exact county boundary creation dates for every single county in the United States from the original counties in the 1600s. and it shows every boundary change, and it talks about every and it gives you all the research back, every state and county and every kind of law that changed the boundaries of the counties back and forth. So you've got a standard there, and there are some other ones that are out there too, but that one's has an interactive map. It's really easy to use, and it has all that information in alphabetical order for every state and every county ever created.
So tie it to the location as it existed at the time of the record, at the time of the event.
Absolutely. If you don't, then I'll come along and change it.
So if you're putting a birth that occurred in Salt Lake City in 1957, it shouldn't be the state of Utah.
No, it should be. Well, it could be, for example, an early one could be Salt Lake. It could be the state of Deseret, actually, for a period of time. So there's records that would be state of Deseret, and then Utah Territory, and then Utah statehood. Okay. Thank you.